I'm happy for the invitation. I'm just gonna try to see so I can see my own presentation. Um, yes, and the results I'm gonna talk about today, they are from a European Horizon 2020 project I did between 2014 and 2018. It's a few years ago, but I've looked at the results and I still think they are valid today. So this project was um, done in Germany, Slovakia, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Latvia, UK, and Romania. And what we wanted to do was to understand youth migration or youth mobility within the EU. Um, and we did a huge survey with 30,000 respondents, and we did 840 in-depth interviews. And we also did an experiment where we kind of wanted to predict future mobility in the EU. And this was a very, I think, successful project. We have over 50 peer review article in the consortium. I think it's more actually, but I did two on migration from. In Sweden, we studied specifically two groups, Latvians and Romanians, who had moved to Sweden. And when I started to look at these two groups, I could see that the research that I looked at and research from other countries, I could see that the mobility was very different from the new member state countries to Sweden compared to the rest of Europe. And so there was this puzzle, because why do EU citizens, especially from the new member state countries, why do they move and stay in Sweden despite that we can see that they have quite low employment rate and they are not in the short term very successful in a way. So that's the puzzle I discuss in the first article, and the second article I also sent as a recommendation to read was more studying the, let's say, the labor market integration process after arriving in Sweden. So we can just look quickly about how mobility changed after Romania and Latvia became member states. We can see that the number of young people moving to Sweden from Romania increased a lot after Romania joined the EU, while it took the mobility from Latvia didn't increase very much. And it was not until the economic crisis in 2010 that we could experience an increase of Latvians to Sweden. So we had an increase, and this is the stock. So we can see that it did change and increase over time. And what is also special of Latvians and Romanians to Sweden specifically is that they're almost only high skilled. So the orange color, it's people we don't know what education they have. So you can see that the yellow is the high skilled. So it's almost only high skilled that are actually moving to Sweden from Latvia of young people. And we can see a similar pattern from Romania, even though there are a few more with high school education. But they are very high skilled in general. But as we can see here, this is the employment rate of young people in Sweden, and the orange line is Sweden, the green is Latvia, the yellow is Romania, and the blue is EU25. So actually, Romanians, Latvians, and all other EU citizens have about 50% employment rate in Sweden, while Swedes have almost 80%. So there is something kind of different going on, because in most European countries, young people that use the mobility actually have a higher employment rate than natives. So there is something very strange going on. So why do people actually choose to move specifically to Sweden then? And I'm not going to go through all the different slides I have because it would take too long, but there are many, many studies on EU mobility emphasizing networks, social networks, and language for explaining youth mobility, and also specifically different kind of labor market regimes. That the UK have a kind of a liberal labor market regime, while a country like Sweden has a more coordinated, organized with and that works differently, and this could affect youth mobility. So I don't want to stay on this for too long, but we can also see in general that Latvians and Romanians are some of the European citizens that actually use their free movement the most. Like today, 20% of all Romanians are actually living outside Romania, which is the highest proportion of any nationals in the EU. And among Latvians, it's about 6%, while in Sweden, it's only 1.5%. So it's a very mobile population, especially from Romania. And I mean, Sweden, together with the UK and Ireland, were the only countries who did not have any restrictions on mobility from day one. But even though Sweden and Ireland and UK were the only countries, we didn't see a huge increase of EU citizens to Sweden compared to what we have seen in Ireland and the UK. So if you look at the literature on this, is that most work have actually been done on the UK and Ireland. And as I said before, they describe a situation that is vastly different than Sweden, because in the UK and Ireland, people are hired into lower skilled jobs using social networks, using companies, recruitment companies, and there's been a lot of mobility to the UK and Ireland, and we all know what happened with Brexit. And we have not seen a discussion like this in Sweden. That and the mobility of Europeans to Sweden are not really discussed at all. So let's look at my specific study. We interviewed 41 persons from Latvia and Romania, and we had a hard time finding lower skilled Latvians and Romanians. We were supposed to interview lower skilled students and higher skilled, but because there are very few lower skilled that move to Sweden, this is kind of representative almost of those if you look at the statistics. So why did they come to Sweden? Studying was the most common reason. 16 persons, 9 had moved to a boyfriend, girlfriend, often a boyfriend, and often a Swedish national. Only 6 persons of 41 came to work, and including PhDs and postdocs, there were 9 persons who came to work. 6 persons expressed that they wanted to move to Sweden because it's Sweden they wanted to move to, and 5 came with families. So if we just look shortly at the different groups, that among the Latvians, only actually 3 out of 20 had a job when moving to Sweden. And we can see that what they do is that they study. And even though 9 came to study, most of the other persons who actually move to join a partner or moving to Sweden for other reasons, they started eventually studying at university, where whatever reason they had for coming here in the first place. And they also tend to enroll in Swedish language training, Swedish for immigrant, as it's called, or at the university. And what I also study in my second article is how they actually integrate and their choices of investing in human capital. And we could see that we interviewed people who had been in Sweden for maybe mostly 2 to 8 years, or in some cases longer, and most have actually experienced worse economic had a worse economic situation in Sweden than they had prior to their mobility. More of the Romanians moved directly to a specific job, and this is mostly because we have a big computer game industry in Malmö, and they also have offices in Bucharest. So they transfer within the same company to different workplaces, and we have the headquarters here in Malmö, so it's something that they want to do, to move to Malmö to work at the headquarters. But they also, a big majority study at Swedish universities, and they also study Swedish, but not as much. And on average, they tended to do a bit better than the Latvians because they had a more planned mobility, and they also work in to a higher degree than Latvians. So just some general experiences before going into kind of the main results is that when we talked to these young people, they all expected to work actually, but even those who came to study, it was normal for them to work outside their studies, but this was found to be very difficult to find a job in Sweden. So eventually most focused only on their university studies instead. But those who did find jobs, they found it in English-speaking workplaces, and in some cases where they can use their skills in the Latvian and Russian language, for example, at ferry lines, travel agencies, and things like that. While the majority actually have to retrain to educate themselves in Swedish, taking a new university degree to actually finding a job in Sweden. So we can, if we just look at this from an economic perspective, from the Swedish perspective, and also from Latvia and Romania perspective, it's kind of big brain waste going on because people are educating themselves for a longer period of time. They move from high skilled jobs in Latvia and Romania to kind of education or lower skilled jobs in Sweden. And those who reintegrate into the Swedish labor market, they have to invest in a long education also in Sweden. So instead of studying for 3 years in Latvia, working, earning quite good, they have to go back to the university for 3 or 4 years in Sweden to come back to the labor market. So from a European perspective, this just makes the education period in young people's lives much longer than kind of what's economists always complain that people study too much. It's enough with 3 years and then work. So this is making young persons study for a longer period of time. So we talked to people and found 6 main reasons why young people chose Sweden and why they decided to stay. And that's free education, romantic relationships, English language, cosmopolitan lifestyle, idealization of Sweden as a country, and work-life balance. So if you take free education, for example, I mean, it's university education is free in Sweden. You can also study this Swedish for immigrants that all non-Nordic citizens are entitled to for free. And also there is a lot of adult education in general that is free. So this is something that is attractive to many people. So even if persons came for romantic reasons or for working or for any other reasons, there's always this opportunity to start studying. And this is kind of a typical quote. So I think that I liked Sweden generally. I was here before, so I thought it was a nice country, of course, with a high level of life and education. Plus, I wanted to have the experience and education from a foreign country. So I was considering a couple of other countries, for example, Germany as well. But then I decided that Sweden is more suitable for me. And then I looked what kind of programs the universities in Sweden offered, and I like the program I'm currently in. It's a service management in logistics. And since it's connected to what I've been doing in my previous job, I thought this could be a new direction for me. Okay, so why did you say that Sweden was more suitable than Germany, for example, for you? So then, as most people come back to, it's kind of, I think that I liked Sweden generally, plus the education system is better. And I thought, yeah, the education is for free. So I think this is a very, the free education is a big reason for coming to Sweden, but also staying, because it's always a choice you can make. But at the same time, it's kind of a hard economic situation during the education. Often the parents are paying for the education, or they have worked for several years before. So it's free, but it's not free to pay for housing and things like that, of course. And something that is very important is the romantic relationships, because you move to Sweden to be with someone you have met previously. Often it's a Swedish national and not a co-ethnic, but it's also a strategy. It's kind of a cynical, and most people think it's kind of sensitive to bring up, but there are actually many, especially females that kind of find relationships as a way to stay. So they are kind of almost a strategy. I need someone to support me during my studies. It was not uncommon. But here we can see that this is connected to, in this quote, also to the education as well, because here is a person who knew each other, but then eventually decided to be a couple and move to Sweden. And she tells us that in Romania, it wasn't a problem getting a job. I was the one jumping from one job to another. If you look at my CV, I've tried different things, but I was an optimist when I was moving here. Christopher was like, oh, it will take a year to get a job. And I said, oh, come on. I mean, in Romania, I had to beg for a 1 week vacation from one job to another. So I said maximum 3 months. But anyway, just in case, I thought, well, it's a backup, or maybe just doing something fun. I said, let's study something. So started with a romantic relationship, ended up moving to her boyfriend, but then started to study in Sweden. And also something that most say that they appreciate is that Malmö and the region around Malmö is a very cosmopolitan region. And most people that move here either move to an English-speaking workplace where you socialize in English, or you study and then you socialize in English. So you're not moving to Sweden, you're not moving to socialize with Sweden or integrating into Sweden, you're integrating into an international environment. And this is something that most people like a lot. They like this international cosmopolitan vibe that they think they can get even from a country like Sweden. So these are some quotes. Like they're very, very excited when they talk about how many countries they have friends from, and how fun that is. So that's actually what they say in these quotes. They don't socialize with co-ethnics. They don't socialize a lot with Swedes. They socialize from people all around the world. And they often try to, yeah, they name drop a lot of different countries. And this is of course connected to the English language, because they are socializing in the English language, but also the context here in Sweden is that most people speak English. So even outside the social circles, you can live quite comfortably in a city like Malmö only using English. So, and the fact that most speak English, it makes it an easier choice to move to Sweden compared to, for example, Spain or France. So one informant said that the thing is that Swedes are very good at knowing English, and they're quite happy. Like, for example, in France, there is just no way I could just exist with English. But people here are a lot more open to that, and that's a very good thing. But also that makes me, if English is sufficient, I have no motivation of actually learning Swedish except for feeling disrespectful to the people living here. So, and in my second article, I show that this is kind of complicated and could be negative, because people move to Malmö, they enjoy it, they socialize in English, they get on very well, but then eventually, after 2-3 years, they decide to settle permanently in Sweden. That's kind of quite common. So then they start this investment in country specific human capital, which takes this integration process a lot longer, because moving to Sweden, most people invest in English skills that can be used all over the world, like education and English workplace environments. And also, it's not uncommon that people choose Sweden for different reasons. They have visited Sweden, they liked it, they have been on Erasmus exchanges. They also think it's a tolerant country. It's children friendly. It's open-minded. So many connect Sweden with different kind of values that they like. And this is one girl who was a master student here in Malmö. She actually became determined to move to Sweden because she really liked the band Roxette. And this made her really delve into the Swedish culture and learning the language. And so she was one of the few that actually spoke a bit of Swedish before coming to Sweden. But there is a lot of things with tolerance against diversity, appreciation of diversity in Sweden. Yeah, different kind of values they think they can, and they respect. Something that most learn to value after coming to Sweden. This is not something that people move to Sweden for. We know it's a good work-life balance, but those who familiarize themselves with Sweden, they find that this is very different than compared to the countries they come from. So starting to thinking about a family, then Sweden is a good place to live, according to our informant. So let's conclude. The puzzle is, why would people move to Sweden when they are not doing very well objectively when it comes to the economic situation? And I highlighted these 6 different factors, and actually very few talk about economic mobility in our interviews. Some that worked for gaming companies wanted to move to Malmö, to the headquarters, but they mostly talked about less hierarchical, more creative, better work-life balance. They didn't talk so much about earning more money. And I think you could start to think about this as a form of lifestyle migration. Lifestyle migration, some of you might know, has been more connected to retirement migration, moving to Spain, counter-urbanization. But I think that even young people, their migration choices could also be thought about as they want a different lifestyle more than economic mobility, at least in the short and mid term. So that's kind of what I wanted to propose, that this is an important factor in the mobility to Sweden specifically, and maybe also for other young people using the free mobility. So thank you.